Matthew P. from Joshua Tree, California.
My name is Matthew. I'm an alcoholic. I'm grateful to be sober with you all this evening, and there's just absolutely no pressure following that. So I actually want to hear more, and I told Stacy that she's very much not punk rock, and I'm going to tell you all. And neither am I. I'm sure there were a few people who saw me walk up onto the dais here and were like, "Oh God, no." But I just hope you can take comfort in the fact that I'm probably, while I'm here, not breaking into your house, sleeping with your husband or your wife, or any of those other things. So. And you're welcome. All right, quick business. My sobriety date is estimated to be around the 28th of June of 2002. It's an estimate because the crappy apartment that I'd lied my way into at the time and that I'd furnished with things I'd pulled out of a dumpster behind a Pier 1, among the things that I pulled out of that dumpster, a calendar wasn't one. So I was not really paying attention to the date, and that had to be sorted out much later. For other reasons too, mostly having to do with lucidity. I have a home group. It's the Thursday night Big Book Study in Yucca Valley, California. It's a lovely group of people who get into this book, and if there is anybody new tonight, I have a sponsor. His name is Mike. I called him beforehand just so I could tell you that I called him beforehand and sound spiritual, and I'm sure he cares. All right, and if there is anybody new here, welcome. I'm sure this sounds absurd. I'm sure we're laughing at things that we're laughing, and when I got sober, laughing wasn't in my repertoire anymore. And but I hope you hear something that makes sense. I hope you find yourself here among this strange assortment of weirdos who, for whatever reason, are at least lying to you and telling you we're happy we're sober. And I actually am happy I'm sober. And that's weird. And hopefully I'm here to share my experience, strength, and hope with you. Hopefully, my experience, strength, and hope makes sense to me, and my job is now to hopefully communicate it in a way that makes sense to you and helps you out. And if I do, great, and if I don't, I'm terribly sorry. And thank you to Sue for asking me to speak, and the whole committee here has been wonderful for inviting me up here to participate in this whole thing. And I hope somebody's timing me, because I'm just going to start talking about myself, and you'll sit back and start thinking about yourselves. And I figure I'll wrap it up about 5 minutes after everyone's filed out, and we'll go from there. So I don't know why I'm an alcoholic. One of the big things that I struggled with in my life was this idea of why anything, and I know there's a genetic component, and some people are alcoholics as a result of some of their upbringing. I don't come from a family of alcoholics. That being said, I come from a family of drinkers, and they love their alcohol, and I learned some valuable lessons, such as alcohol abuse consists of pouring it out, spilling it, wasting it in any way. And so I learned that alcohol is something that belongs inside me, and I started pursuing that from a young age. My very first drunk, I don't remember a whole lot about it. I've had alcohol in me since I was a child too. My first job was going to the beer tapper that my dad owned and fetching mugs of beer for him and my aunt, and I'd charge them, and I would of course skim off the top a few times to make sure the beer tasted all right before I delivered it and collected my fee. But my first drunk, my family, I grew up all over the place. My dad worked for the airlines, so we moved around a lot. At the age of 11, we packed up, left a tiny town in Wisconsin, and moved to the island of Guam. And I landed there, and within a couple weeks, there was the company New Year's party, and to welcome the new boss and his family, and I don't remember much about it. I know Afterwards, my folks told me that a couple of minutes before the fireworks were to go off at midnight, they found their middle son sprawled across the table, passed out. Had to send me home out of embarrassment. And the only other real lesson I learned from that was that I discovered my 2 favorite flavors of alcohol, which are free and more. And there were just these waiters that would come by with these glasses of champagne, and I was 11, I'm like, great, okay. Oh, more? Great, okay. And that's what I discovered about it. But more importantly for my alcoholism was that a little ways down the road, I discovered another valuable thing about alcohol. At first it was, hey, this is great, it makes a good time better, this is fantastic. And the second time, after a friend of mine committed suicide, and we went to a bar, and we discovered that alcohol could make the pain go away, that it could change how I felt. And I loved that. That was magical. I needed that. I didn't understand life. I didn't understand how to do this thing. I knew that some point in 1st or 2nd grade, there was a day at school where they took everybody aside and they handed them a book and said, here is how you do life. And this is how you know what you want to be and know what you want to do and act like it. And I was sick that day. And so I spent my entire childhood trying to play catch up on what I thought everybody around me had going on. And that just, that was tiring, to say the least. I was just running after people, trying to think, how do I make this make sense? And suddenly alcohol did this beautiful thing. It made me not care. And it was beautiful. I don't know if alcohol ever made me think I was prettier or more handsome or was capable of talking to anybody or made me think I was smarter. The big thing for me is that it made me not care, and I pursued that. Growing up on a little island, I was probably kept out of some scrapes and was able to get into other scrapes. The very first time I got arrested, I was breaking and entering on a Navy base. Which they don't like. It's weird. Some things I learned about alcoholism later on. One thing I should state, I never really thought about my drinking. I just didn't think about it. I just drank. Alcohol was a beverage. It was wet. I put it in me. Life was better. But it was pointed out to me at one point that maybe, just maybe, non-alcoholics don't do this thing where when you're sitting on a little island and you discover that there's a cheap fare deal to Tokyo, and that you work out that the free alcohol on an international flight costs less than a night in the bar. And so you buy your tickets, grab your passport, call your friends, and go. And you drink and smoke the whole way up to Tokyo and then all the way back. And allegedly I've been to Hong Kong, but I have no memory. And this is how we'd run. And when I got sober and people, I started hearing people talk about these things that we talk about, like, pre-drinking and blackouts. And I didn't know, I actually thought I didn't have any blackouts because I couldn't remember any. And then it was pointed out to me, it's like, hey, remember that night that you went out for a beer and you woke up in the Navy barracks? Yeah, that's a blackout. On a base I wasn't supposed to be on, obviously. So anyways, that was it. There were a lot of consequences to my drinking early on. It was just fun. It was what I was doing. It was my sense of being, free from control, that I wasn't square, that I was totally punk rock, everything like that, that just made me okay. And when I was 20 years old, I moved to the States and discovered the bad timing of that because drinking age on Guam was 18. Suddenly I'm 20 years old living in the States, and I couldn't drink, and that was a miserable 6 months. But played catch up, not a problem. Turned 21, it was all right. Ultimately, I don't want to go into a lot of drinking. I drank a lot. 15 years ago this month was the very first time I ever realized that maybe there was something wrong with my drinking. It's part of why I commemorate Kentucky Derby every year, because Kentucky Derby parties, and they were great. There was a lot of sugar and mint getting in the way of the bourbon, but you make do. And I was on the verge of following through on a very carefully thought out plan whereby I would leave the States and move to Poland, because that would fix me. And I don't know why. Poland seemed like a viable option. And I was running away to Poland. I guess the circus wasn't in town. So So my parents still lived overseas. This was my last chance to talk to them. And I was so drunk that weekend that I could not complete a sentence. And this was the last chance I was going to have to talk to my parents for months and maybe years. And I couldn't complete a sentence. I was so drunk. And then on top of that, the entire conversation, and I used the word conversation wrongly, obviously, because really they were talking and I was sort of mumbling. I continued to open beers the entire conversation. I could not even stop drinking long enough to have that conversation. And I'm very grateful that my parents are still in my life today. By every right, they should have given up on me, but they didn't. And but that was the first time in my life that I ever stopped and was like, something's not right about that. And then I quickly got over it, went back to the bar, and got back to drinking, and then proceeded to try to move to Poland. And fortunately, en route, I got pulled over in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is on the way. It's a lovely town. I recommend visiting it not through its corrections. And I, was drinking and drugging my way across the country. I'm a good boy, so I don't drink and drive. So I was doing lots of other things during the day while I drove, and then I could get to the hotel and drink myself to sleep, get up the next day, do it over again. And in that way, get across the country without having to draw a sober breath. And really, I wasn't capable of it at that point. Obviously, landing in jail sort of put a pause in my international jet set plans. And I was trapped. And it was this weird thing because I had always been a very smart kid. I'd always been a very capable kid. I was junior barfly, and I was so proud of myself when the old guys in the bar dubbed me the poster child for wasted potential, and I thought that was so cool. And and I lied my way into jobs where I was training people with master's degrees from MIT while I couldn't actually complete a semester at college. So I'm amazing, I'm capable, and suddenly I'm in this jail cell, and the door would not open through the sheer force of my will. And no matter how much I thought about it, and believe me, I was not sleeping, so I was thinking about it a lot, that door still did not open. And I had to sit. And I had to sit in detox in a little jail in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Looking back on it, having to land in Minnehaha County, it could not have been a smaller ha-ha met. But fortunately, somebody still loved me enough to fly across the country and bail me out of jail. And in my intense capacity for gratitude, the very first thing I said when he saw me and he got me out of jail, my very first words were, "Can we stop at a liquor store?" That week in jail was the longest I'd been without a drink pretty much since I was 20 years old. I'd actually counted, which probably was also a problematic sign, that over the course of 4 or 5 years, I had not, aside that week in jail, I hadn't spent more than a day not drinking. And that may have been a sign to somebody who was paying attention. But I wasn't. So, got out of jail, lied and said I was moving to Chicago, because that made sense. Landed in Chicago. I was told to get into treatment, get an address, get my nose clean, get settled, and then obviously come back for court. So I proceeded to do those things. I lied my way into an apartment. I was still drinking. Fortunately, everything else I was doing, I wasn't that good at it. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know how to get anything else. So for the last month of my drinking, I was just drinking. And I was drinking a lot. And I landed in Chicago, which is a great city to drink in. It's also a fantastic city to get sober in, too, it turns out. How to put it? So lied my way into an apartment, furnished it from a dumpster, proceeded to wander around and discover that nobody wanted to hire a guy who was facing prison time in South Dakota, and who didn't have really an address and all that stuff, and managed to get into a treatment center. It was an outpatient program. It was very beautiful, much like your spa. It was It was under the railroad tracks next door to a laundromat in a little strip mall. It was beautiful. I was dubbed the angry guy with the bike seat. I would bicycle to my outpatient treatment programs, and I'd lock up the bike outside, and I'd pull the seat off, and I'd storm in, and I'd slam the seat under the chair, and I'd sit down, and I'd scowl at everyone and go, and complain to them about what I was paying them to do, even though I was on the homeless sliding scale. And, and I would be like, oh yeah, this clearly works. You've been here, 10 times? And I was a royal delight. And in fact, just so anybody knows, please, if you are working on a gratitude list and you're struggling and you need something to add to it, you can add not knowing me my first year of sobriety. I was such a treasure. The woman in that treatment center, bless her heart, she would tell me, there are things I'm legally required to teach you, there are things I think you ought to know, but if you want to stay sober, if you want to get out of the system, if you want to get on with your life, you need to go to a 12-step program. And then she'd look straight at me and say, you need to go to AA. And of course, I'd lied on the intake about how much I drank, which she still thought I was an alcoholic, which I thought was rude. And I was there so I wouldn't go to prison for a drug problem. So how could I be an alcoholic? But she continued to hammer on that and hammer on that and hammer on that. And so doing all this stuff, alcohol in the meantime broke up with me, which was incredibly rough. Alcohol had been I'd moved around a lot. I'd made and lost a lot of friends. I'd screwed up a lot of family relations. And alcohol was the one that was always there for me. And it was beautiful, and I loved it, and it made me feel okay, and it made me not care. It essentially did what I paid it to do. And that sounds like love. And sorry, that was bad. That was inappropriate, sorry. But at a certain point, again, we estimate around the 28th of June, alcohol stopped working. And being the quick study I am, I was sitting alone in my apartment, doing that thing where, I'm going up to check the blinds to make sure no one's walking up to my apartment, even though I'm on the 6th floor. And I'm partying, which means double-checking the locks. And I'm sitting there in this beautiful apartment. Yes, it had a mouse problem, but it turns out DTs can make you think it also has like a bat problem and some other things. And suddenly alcohol stopped working. I opened a beer. It was pretty much all I could afford at that point. It was really good beer, as you can imagine. And drank about half of it, and I just couldn't finish it. And so I poured it out. And I thought, well, that's weird. That's alcohol abuse. That's not right. So I opened another beer, and I started drinking it, and I couldn't finish it. And I poured it out. That's not right. That's alcohol abuse. Open another one, and I went through that entire 6-pack, drinking about a couple swigs out of each bottle, before it just finally hit me that I couldn't be drunk and I couldn't be sober. And it just wasn't working. At that point, I like to think alcohol broke up with me. And it was not pretty. I was, I'm one of those terrible clingy exes. I'm like, no, please take me back. And it just wouldn't work. And so there I am, I'm trapped. The only thing that ever made sense in life stopped working. And there I was, this bright, capable young man. I just turned 25 years old. And suddenly, alcohol wasn't working, and nothing made sense. I always like to describe how I came into AA, and pretty much the short form of it is that I was nearly homeless, I was unemployable, I was facing prison time in South Dakota, and I was wandering the streets of Chicago being chased by spies. And that is the lovely creature that wandered into the Rogers Park Alano Club in the summer of 2002. It's this dingy little place that was founded in the back room of a funeral parlor, so it was, a place of hope. And it was this dingy place. It was a lovely place where the drug dealers on the street would come into the meeting to do their deals because it was safer than staying out on the sidewalk. And that was my introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous. In my very first meeting, I remember I remember that I walked in and for some strange reason decided to sit on the opposite side of the room from the door so that if I was going to try to sneak out, I'd have to draw a lot of attention to myself, yes, obviously I draw a lot of attention to myself now, but back then I was really trying to lay low. And I sat there, and I didn't know what was going on. People sounded like Charlie Brown's parents. It was just mwah, 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 drunk, mwah, 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 alcohol, mwah. But at the same time, through all the fog, I know they had two topics at that meeting. One was gratitude and one was faith. Now, I could give you a dictionary definition for either of those words, but I've never sat in a bar and talked about either of those things. I think at that point, my capacity for gratitude was essentially if something bad happened to you, I could go, not me. And that passed for gratitude. As far as faith goes, another reason I was such a treasure in early AA, I was prone to outbursts in meetings. I had this difficulty of not just saying what was on my mind when it came through, regardless of who was sharing. And I frequently blurted out in meetings such wonderful treasures as, it's really cute you all can delude yourselves into thinking there's an imaginary friend in the sky who grants wishes, but I'm actually smart. And I was challenging people on faith all the time. It was wonderful seeing the steps on the wall, seeing the word God. I was like, I'm having nothing to do with this. You're clearly a cult. This is not going to work for me. And yet, there was no place else for me to go. No one wanted me. My family didn't know what to do with me. The only people who wanted me were the prisons in South Dakota, and I wasn't even sure if they were keen. It was my only place. Fortunately, that very first meeting, a young woman who had never been to that meeting before but was working at a hospital nearby and just needed a meeting, stopped in, saw me, heard me say something about my first meeting ever, and grabbed me and pulled me off to the side and said, all right, here's a list of meetings. This is the big book. You need to get one. Here's a phone number. You should call him. He's a good guy. He's a reference. Of course, in my addlepated state, I heard her say, he's expecting your call, and probably if you don't call him, the spies will know. And so, thus became my first sponsor. Alex was a lovely man. He screamed at me a lot. He was a delight. However, there were two things that he said to me from the very first time we talked. And he said, do you think you're an alcoholic? And that was revolutionary, because at that point I had lots of people telling me I was an alcoholic, but he was the first person that ever asked me if I thought I was one. And I honestly had to answer, I don't know. It didn't make sense to me. I'm too smart to be an alcoholic. I don't look like an alcoholic. I did look like an alcoholic, but but I just didn't know. And in a rare moment of honesty, I said, I don't know. Fortunately for me, that moment of honesty didn't last, because his next question to me was, do you think you're done? Have you had enough? And I surmised that the correct answer was yes. So that's what I told him. And, fortunately, maybe I wasn't lying, to this date, the answer to that question has continued to be yes, I've had enough, I'm done. I can't do it. As far as learning about whether or not I was an alcoholic and solving that first one, first order of business, he was like, all right, I'm giving you the list. Each day, I want you to not drink, go to a meeting, talk to an alcoholic, and call me. If you do those things on a daily basis, you're a success. And I bit, because I didn't have any success going on in my life at that point. So every morning I started the list. I wrote it out on a piece of paper. Don't drink, go to a meeting, call Alex, talk to an alcoholic. And I would strike them off as I did it. And the weird thing was that over time, as much as I didn't believe in God, I didn't really want what you people have, and I wasn't sure if I was one of you, over time, there was this stack of lists that were all crossed off in the corner of my kitchen. And it was this tangible evidence that I hadn't had a drink in several months, and it was weird. And Fortunately, Alex looked at me and he said, I don't care what you think and I don't care what you feel. What are you doing today to stay sober? Which was great, because feelings were terrifying. Part of why I drank was to not have them. I'm already sort of emotionally retarded and semi-autistic anyway, so feelings were bad. I would call him up sometimes in the middle of the night and just say, I'm feeling. And he would be like, is there an end to that sentence? I was like, there doesn't need to be. There just didn't need to be. But he didn't care what I felt. He wanted to know what I was doing each day to stay sober, and I had the list of things I needed to do. And I was going to these meetings. They didn't make sense. It was weird. It was scary. There were people there. I've never looked at a group of people and thought that was a terrific idea. So suddenly me going to join groups was weird. And I'm showing up at these meetings, and the next thing you know, I'm wishing the other 23 hours of the day felt as good as that 1 hour I was in the meeting. And I was like, what is happening to me? I'm sure there's always, you probably have it here, it seems to be everywhere I've been in AA, there's that stereotypical old fart who sits by the door, and as I'm trying to race out to get out so I don't have to hold hands with you people or hug or anything like that, he grabs my arm, stops and says, hey, how they say keep coming back? I was like, yes. He's like, screw that, just stay. I was like, yes, sir. I didn't know, and then I quickly ran out. But that stuck with me, and I don't know why the things from early sobriety stuck with me. And I was not a model little citizen of AA. There were people who were placing cash bets on a weekly basis that I was not going to come back. If I had any money, I would have taken them up on it. As it turns out, I didn't have any money on it. So I was, terrified and embarrassed when the basket came around, which meant I started to do silly things like stay after the meeting and help wash coffee cups and empty ashtrays and sweep floors and stack chairs and things that just staved off and tried to extend that moment, that hour that I was in the meeting that I felt, I don't want to say good, but I felt less terrified. I still didn't know what you all were about. And, I wish I could remember her name, but the name isn't as important as the fact that this one woman came up to me after a meeting one time and said the most magical words I've ever heard in my life. And they were, stick with us, kid, and you'll be okay. And I didn't know what okay was anymore. And it turns out that's all I really wanted was okay, And don't get me wrong, I will ruin happiness because I'm not ecstatic. I will find bliss dissatisfying. Because it turns out, as I started to pursue this thing in AA, and I started to sit down with my sponsor and go through this stupid book that was, I have a friend who works in publishing, and the way she describes it is, it's not the worst book you'll ever read, but it's the worst book you'll ever read twice. And, or in my case, too many times to count. And I started to find myself in there, and I started to get it, and I started to explore what it means to be an alcoholic. And listening to people in meetings, I was starting to get worried that maybe what it meant to be an alcoholic was some of the consequences. I've never been pulled over for drunk driving. I've never lost a job due to drinking. I've not gotten jobs due to drinking, but I never lost a job, so clearly I'm better than you. I haven't lost spouses or kids to drinking, mostly because I couldn't get them. And, all these things, but I started to learn that my alcoholism isn't the consequences. I'm not an alcoholic because I was facing prison time. I'm not an alcoholic because I was selfish or fearful. It turns out I know lots of people who aren't alcoholics who are selfish and are fearful. But they don't drink themselves to death over it, and that's my problem. I have this weird thing where I take a drink and I get thirsty. And it seems that the rest of the world has it backwards, because they take a drink and they're like, okay, I'm satisfied, I'm done. And to me, I take a drink and it's like, more now, please. And then this weird thing happens where alcohol pukes me up wherever it's done, and believe me, it has been on a variety of continents. And that was a shocking realization when I came to step 9 and I was on probation and couldn't cross state lines, and yet I owed amends on 3 continents. But when alcohol is finished with me, it pukes me up somewhere, and my first thought is, let's have a drink. It's flashing back to that moment. The minute I got out of jail in South Dakota, first words out of my mouth are not thank you, not how are you doing, not wow, how much did this cost you? It was, can we stop at a liquor store? And I may not have even phrased it as a question. I may have just said, we must stop at a liquor store. That's what alcoholism is for me. I can't control my drinking. I can't stop and I can't stay stopped. So it turns out, hey, step one, done. Matthew's doomed. Matthew can't keep himself sober. Which was terrifying because essentially there I am, I'm not capable of keeping me sober, and there's no God. Great. And I was still showing up, I was participating, I was being a member of AA, I was still arguing with all of you about the non-existence of God. And much to the credit of every member of AA in the north side of Chicago during those days who put up with me and told me things like, keep coming back, just stay. I'm sure they were wincing when they said it. And then, as was my habit to disrupt the meeting and argue with you while you were sharing, I was on one of my tirades one time, and this old man stood up in the meeting and said, you know what, if we wanted what you have, we'd ask you. But we don't, so shut up. And, blessedly, for whatever reason, I didn't storm out of AA and said, screw this, see, I told you you were a cult, you're all, everything that I wanted to say about it. I sat down and I started to listen. And I didn't know what was going on, but you know what, at a certain point, my sponsor pointed to the stack of lists in the corner of my kitchen. And he said, it's like, all right, we've done step one. You realize you don't keep you sober. And I'm like, no, I definitely don't. He's like, so what's up with the stack of lists? Why is it that you've not had a drink in 3, 4, 5 months? How is this possible? And I had to concede that I didn't know. And so that was just that crack of willingness that started it. I was still problematic. He wanted me to start praying every day. I didn't know what prayer was. I didn't really want to pray. I didn't know who to pray to because there's nobody there, duh. And fortunately, the patient members of AA, somebody gave me the suggestion, why don't you pray to whom it may concern? Because it doesn't concern you. And I tend to be very literal, so I took that. And so my prayer life has been getting up in the morning, to whom it may concern, please keep me sober today, thanks, bye. And then I'd go to work, and I'd go to meetings, and I'd go about my day, and then I'd come home after it all, and I'd go to bed, and I'd get on my knees and say, to whom it may concern, thanks for keeping me sober today, thanks, bye. And that's what it was. And you know what? I did it. And I was showing up, and I was starting to feel better. And I don't know, I'm not a cosmologist, I don't understand it all. The point is, I didn't have to figure it out. I get to be sober. Step 3 comes along, I'm terrified because I know what it really means is like, yeah, okay, higher power, God, whatever. The problem is I'm now having to concede that it has a will. I'm having to concede that I'm turning my life over to you all, because that's really what this is about. And to make it worse, my sponsor was taking me to what they call in the northern suburbs of Chicago a third step meeting, where you go and you take over another meeting and you get a bunch of people and you talk about the third step, and you take the third step as a group. And he was taking me to the far outer suburbs of Chicago, and I knew that this was the moment where I was doing the third step, and what that meant was that I was moving onto the compound, I was never seeing any of my family or friends again, I had drank the Kool-Aid, and I was trapped in AA now. And, and to be honest, at that point, I almost didn't care anymore. As terrifying as that was, what I had waiting for me in Chicago wasn't that great. I was still living in that formerly bat-infested, now just rat-infested apartment. I was working a crappy job. I was still potentially at any moment going to prison. And, and I definitely wasn't making it to Poland. And so I just went. And I sat in this room, and people who I had never seen before, and I don't think I've ever seen since, talked about what the third step was doing in their lives. And at the end of it, they looked at me and said, do you want to do it? And I said, I got nothing, let's. And I got on my knees with a room of about 20 people, and we held hands, and we said the third step prayer together. And I was like, this is it. They're going to shave my head. I'm not going home tonight. And instead I got up off my knees, and I'm like, okay, so what's God's will for me? And they're like, do your fourth step. That's it? And I got to do that, and I got to pursue these steps, and gruelingly, I fought every step of the way. The fourth step was, of course, this epic battle between good and evil for my soul. Nations were, of course, going to fall based on my petty little secrets, and yet I had to just take an inventory. And I got to read in the 12 and 12 where it talks about just being, really just a discussion of how my instincts are out of whack. Okay. And I would just do this stuff. And you know what? There were times where I just had to be mechanistic about being a sober member of AA. I would go to meetings. I would pray. Obviously, I was praying with all my heart, to whom it may concern, please keep me sober today. And I was going to meetings, and I was saying prayers with people after the meeting, and I was sweeping and mopping, and I was showing up to my home group, and I was doing these things. And sometimes my fourth step really was just a case of, okay, click the boxes. I'm getting on my knees saying the third step prayer, picking up pen in one hand, phone in the other, start writing. If my pen started to waver, I'd make a phone call to a member of my home group. Sometimes I would meet up with other people who were working on their fourth step, and we got together, and we didn't necessarily share notes, but we just supported each other through the process. And my sponsor reinforced for me the fact that if I was working on it at least a little bit each day, sometimes it was a word, sometimes it was 4 pages that I wrote, but I put in the effort, I'd done something for my sobriety that day, and I could do it, and I was continuing to do it. And day by day, I don't know how, I worked on the fourth step every day, and before you know it, it was done. And there were still those people who were like, I'd show up to the meeting and they'd be like, oh my God, he showed up again, here's the $50. And I was starting to get a little sense of things, so I was starting to show up and handing them Literature for Gamblers Anonymous. And I was like, hey, you're not keeping me out. And I would just start doing these things, and I was showing up, and my sponsor was taking me to these places. One of my favorite lines, I can't quote the big book to save my life, as smart as I think I am. I can't tell you, well, on page 22 it says. What it says, though, it's least favorite chapter, favorite sentence, we agnostics, page 44. After a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life, or else. And my sponsor had even written on the top of how it works in my first big book, if I don't find a spiritual solution, I will find a chemical one. And that's my default state. My default state is drunk. I am naturally restless, irritable, and discontent, and I need that sense of ease and comfort. And the best way I know how to do that is to take a drink. Problem is, I take a drink, drinks take drinks, and next thing you know, I'm maybe in Hong Kong or, Sioux Falls. And, but I needed that or else, and that was key. I needed that. My sponsor, I knew what or else looked like for me because I was facing that prison time, and I knew what it was like to go through detoxing in a little apartment by myself. I had, but they were taking me to prisons and jails and psych wards and homeless shelters all around Chicago, and I was getting to see what or else smells like and what or else sounds like. And I got to go on a 12-step call where we found a man who had drunk himself to death 6 days before in an unventilated apartment in the middle of summer in Chicago. I know what or else smells like, and that smell will never leave me. And obviously it's not enough to keep me sober, but it was something that spurred me to go, you know what, I need this. I don't want that. I don't want what I have, and I don't want what lays ahead of me if I'm continuing to pursue my agenda, which my agenda is the quickest relief to my restlessness, my irritability, and discontent. So, I had this home group. They were lovely. They were dragging me around. They would remind me of silly things like, hey, Matthew, you have a deadly disease. Why don't you act like it? They would make me these wonderful promises like, we can't promise you that you won't go back to prison, but you probably won't have to drink. And, they were really comforting and loving. And but they taught me how to show up. They taught me this thing that we read and how it works, and I always get caught up on the words rigorous honesty, but there's words before that in the sentence, and it talks about the fact that they develop a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. And that's why I had a sponsor, and I had a home group, and I continue to have those things, because I need that group of people who expect better of me, who expect me to show up, who expect me to tell the truth, who model it for me, because, I don't naturally know how to be honest. I don't naturally know how to suit up and show up. But they've taught me how to do it. They call me on it when I don't. And that's how I've started to just learn and be a part of this fellowship. And I don't know how long I've been going on for, but forever. When do I have to stop? Now? I don't know, I'll just keep going until you walk out. But I was learning this stuff and I was just showing up. And next thing you know, I wasn't going to prison, I was on probation. And I couldn't cross state lines, but I was at least not probably going to prison. I just had to pee in a cup frequently, which was new because I was used to peeing in a bucket, and or in the alley or wherever. And I was learning things from people, like they would take me out to dinner after a meeting, and I didn't know how to eat. Obviously I've learned. But I didn't know how to eat, and unfortunately there were members of AA who would do silly things like call me at 9 in the morning and say, hey, have you had breakfast? No. Well, why don't you? And then they'd hang up. And then they'd call me back at 1 and say, hey, have you had lunch? No. Well, why don't you? Hang up, and then they'd see me at the meeting that night and they would say, hey, have you had dinner? No. Well, come join us. And they took me out, and then they taught me things like, hey, at this table we use silverware. And all these things that were just basic civilized humanity that I didn't know. And I'm very grateful that nobody in my early days of sobriety said, one of the promises of AA is that you'll be a human being. Because I would have walked out. That is like a short-change promise. I don't want to be, you're not my favorite species. I'm not keen on being a human being. I was working towards robot. That was good for me. But I started to learn how to do these basic things that I should know. I'm a capable, intelligent adult, but I didn't know how to do those things anymore. And they dragged me around to places, and we went, and I got to develop a fellowship in the home group that I went to and some other meetings, and I started to develop friends in AA and people who started to count on me. My family came back into my life. My older brother, he and I hadn't had a good relationship since I was 10. He started asking me to look after his son, and I was supposed to be going to prison, and suddenly he's asking me to babysit my nephew and inviting me to be a part of his life again. My parents were starting to be able to come to the States to visit. All these things were just progressing along, and I have to admit, I never had a pink cloud. I'm envious of people who did. I was just getting sober on the streets. It was just day-to-day, don't drink, show up. I'm jealous of that pink cloud, but I also have to admit, I didn't really have any major problems in my early sobriety. I just went to meetings, and I was of service, and I didn't know why, I didn't know how emptying ashtrays was going to keep me sober. I didn't know what the steps had to do with my drinking, besides the first one. But I was just showing up and doing this stuff, and I'm very grateful that people were smart enough in AA to catch me and note things like, hey, we won't promise you that things will get better. We have no control over things. And knowing one thing will go wrong in your life, and you're going to call us all liars and say, I'm done, I'm out. And they said, we can't promise you that things will get better, but if you do these steps, if you live this life with us, we promise that you'll get better. And I have. It's incredible. I eat with silverware. It's neat. Over that course of those couple of years in Chicago, I was a part of AA. We started meetings and treatment centers. We did these things. We were part of it. I got off probation. I was finally able to cross state lines again. My husband and I moved to Chicago, from Chicago to Joshua Tree, where I learned exactly what people had told me all over again. Hey, you know what? When you get there, go to 90 meetings in 90 days, get a sponsor, take the steps, be of service. And I started to do those things. At first it was hard because I just wanted to call people back home in Chicago and complain about how awful AA is in California. And people had warned me. They were like, people clap and they hug out there. And but it was just showing up and doing it. Now, the vast majority of my sobriety has been in California. And we got married, and I started to be a part of the community. And at a certain point, I went back to school. And last year, in the course of 1 month, I turned 39 years old. I turned 14 years sober. I graduated with my bachelor's degree and became a published scientist. It's crazy. This next month, Matthew willing, God, that's debatable, but also there's the, when people are like, God willing, I'm like, chances are if there's a God, God's willing. How willing are you? Next month, turn 40 years old, and I'll turn 15 years sober. It's like more than a third of my life has been in sobriety. I'm on the verge of moving to Baltimore so I can start a PhD program at Johns Hopkins University. And, these things that shouldn't happen. I'm supposed to be the drunk. I've essentially doubled my life expectancy. People were telling me, including fortune tellers, which, multiple fortune tellers told me I'd be dead at 20. Ha ha ha. I'm like on my third mortgage on life. And, it all comes down to the fact that I was a member of AA. You guys taught me the steps. You guys taught me how to take an inventory, taught me how to develop a relationship with a higher power that I wasn't even sure was there, and then be of service to others. The whole point of this thing, as my sponsor always reminds me, is not to turn Matthew into a terrific guy, as much as I like to think it's turned me into an excellent guy. That's not the point. The point is that it's supposed to get me well enough to help another alcoholic. And, I've had the privilege of sponsoring some people. I've been taken through the steps. I've been taken through the traditions. I've learned how to take the principles from both the steps and the traditions and apply them in my life to the point where I have a relationship with my husband and with my family and with my community and with members of AA and members, in the scientific community and elsewhere. And these things are amazing to me because I'm not somebody who looks at people and say, hey, that's what I want, I don't want to be a friend. I don't want to be a peer. I want to be left alone. And yet, through the course of just showing up and being a part of this thing and having a modicum of faith that what you all told me was not garbage, and relying on that idea that, hey, stick with us, kid, and you'll be okay. And I've gotten to be okay. And, not every day is great, but the promise wasn't that I'd get to be great all the time. The promise was that I could be okay. I didn't have to take a drink today. So I offer the same to anybody out there. And I don't like the if you're new because it makes it sound like, hey, there's the initiation phase of AA and then we graduate to full member. I learned early on that, the people who had more time than I'd been alive, they were doing the exact same things that they were telling me to do. It wasn't, hey kid, go do that. It was, hey kid, join us and we'll do this thing. And I offer the same to all of you. Stick with us and you'll be okay. So I'm very grateful that I got to be here and bore you to death. And I guess I should shut up. So thanks.